Hey everybody, this is Eric Bond, the founder of Beat the GMAT, and welcome to today's Write Like an Expert series session. Today we're going to be taking a look at the application essay questions for this year's 2012-2013 MIT Sloan School of Management application. So if you're new to the Write Like an Expert series, a really quick history. This is actually the fourth year that we're putting on this webinar series where we ask top MBA admissions experts to join our community live to break down each essay question for the world's most competitive business schools. Joining us today are our good friends at Veritas Prep and the head consultant at Veritas Prep, Sylvia Dizon. So a little background on both. So Veritas Prep, if you don't know them already, you should definitely check out veritasprep.com. It's an elite test prep and admissions consulting company. They've helped more than 30,000 students achieve their dreams in MBA admissions and graduate school admissions in the last 10 plus years that they've existed. So again, check out veritasprep.com. They have a lot of great resources on their website, and it's also worth taking a note of their services and other products that they offer as well. Sylvia Dizon, as I mentioned, is the head consultant at Veritas Prep. I'm going to let her do her full introduction, but some quick things to note. She's a 2008 graduate of the MIT Sloan School of Management MBA program and has worked very closely with MIT Sloan's admissions office in the past. So no doubt she'll have a lot of great insights to share with us today. Before I hand it off to Sylvia, though, I just want to say a few things about today's structure. So first, in a moment, I'm going to have Sylvia go through her presentation and perspectives about this year's 2012-2013 MIT Sloan School of Management application essay questions. After Sylvia's presentation, we're going to ask her to stick around to answer your questions live. So if you have a question about MIT Sloan's essays and you wish to have Sylvia answer your questions live, you can do so by posting your question as a new comment right in the MBA Watch comment wall for the Sloan pages. And we're going to see the questions coming in. It'll be a moderated chat, so we'll publish one by one your questions and have Sylvia answer them live. There won't be any audio or video for the Q&A, but it'll be all text chatting. So all that being said, I think we're ready to get started. So Sylvia, the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you, Eric. So before we launch into the questions, I'll just do a very quick intro about myself. So again, my name is Sylvia Dizon. I am a head consultant here at Veritas Prep, and I am a 2008 graduate of the Sloan School of Management at MIT. So as you can see here, I was involved with several student activities, but in particular, I was a co-chair of the Student Senate Admissions Committee, as well as the coordinator for the Student Ambassadors Program. So if any of you have visited the campus at MIT, you will probably be familiar with the Student Ambassadors Program. And if not, it's worth a visit. So before we begin diving into all of the questions, I think it would be helpful to just do a brief overview of the questions in general. So a few things to note about this year's application. You can see here that the written elements of the application consist of one cover letter and two required essays, as well as a supplemental information essay, which is optional. So what's different about the application this year is that as opposed to having three required essays, there are just two required essays. And the wording for some of the questions is a little bit different. And as you'll see when we get into the supplemental information for the last optional essay, you'll see that there's some new formatting options that are available to applicants. So I think it's going to be a pretty interesting and exciting year for applicants to have more options, and probably for the admissions committee as well to get to know applicants a little bit better. So let's walk through all of them. Hopefully by the end of this session you'll feel a lot more comfortable and a lot more confident moving forward with your MIT Sloan application. So the cover letter. The cover letter has been a part of the MIT Sloan application for several years, which indicates that it's really an effective way for the admissions committee to get to learn about applicants. It's also, for applicants, tends to be one of the trickier parts of the MIT Sloan application, especially if you've been working on several different applications and you're starting to get into a groove with how your materials are coming together, and then you get to the cover letter. There's nothing really else like it in any of the other top programs or for most business schools in general. So it's easy for students to get a little bit hung up on it. So again, we'll spend probably the bulk of this conversation, or a good portion of it at least, talking about the cover letter and ways that you can feel a little bit more comfortable moving forward on your strategy of writing an effective cover letter. So here's a few things to think about when you're setting up your approach to the cover letter. One way that I found it helpful when I was writing mine, and also when I'm coaching and working with applicants to write theirs, it can be helpful to think of it like a highlight reel or a movie trailer. So if you think about both of those things, those are, they give some best of snapshots. And in the context of a cover letter, this would be essentially personal and professional accomplishments, right? And in a short period of time, you're able to get a really good sense of what direction this is heading. You get a good tone and a good feel for how you're moving forward. So rather than get really hung up on it, just sometimes it's helpful in your brainstorming phase to think, okay, if I want, what do I want my brand to look like? If I were a movie and if I were trying to capture myself, package myself very briefly, what would that look like? And that will probably give you some good ideas about how the cover letter will start to take shape. The other important element of the cover letter is think of it very much like a cover letter for applying to a job. So at the end of the day, it's important to remember that the MBA programs in general, they're professional programs. And also, you basically, when you start any one of these programs, you really start recruiting right when you hit the ground. I'm not saying that so much to intimidate, so much as to say, you know, they are going to be looking for people who are ready or who have enough skills to move forward professionally and be successful there. So there's obviously going to be tons of support in any program around recruiting and around professional development, but some of the basics that they'll be looking for are you able to follow directions? Are you able to speak clearly or write clearly? Are you able to present yourself and use good judgment with the examples you choose? So it is effective, and this is it is effective for the admissions committee to get a little bit of an insight into how you are able to interact professionally and round about what your skills are in that area. So the other thing worth noting when you're planning on writing your cover letter and sketching out some of the things you want to include, it's important to note that there's no time window. There's no limitation in the time in which of things you can talk about versus the essays. For the 2 required essays, the admissions committee requests that you use examples from the past 3 years. So the nice thing about the cover letter is it doesn't have that limitation. You actually are able, if there's any events throughout your life that you feel were really important to you and really important for you to share with the admissions committee, that should be fair game. Now this is really helpful because, again, recalling that idea of a highlight reel, the cover letter is a great way to put together basically a summary of all the things you're really proud of and give them a snapshot of who you are. And this also sets the tone for the rest of the application. It's really your first introduction where you can introduce yourself to the admissions committee. So the cover letter, rather than being a frightening thing, might help to think of it as a really great opportunity to shape what they're starting to see about you. So let's walk through some strategies now about around the cover letter, some things that will be important for you to remember as you start to put pen to paper. So one of the most important things to remember is, or to note, is that there is no request in the instructions of the cover letter to discuss your long and short-term career goals or to be very explicit about why MBA. This is very different than most of the applications you'll see out there, and there's very specific reasons for this. If you talk to anyone at the MIT admissions committee, they will note that they really believe firmly that in the 2 years that you're in this program, a student is going to be exposed to several things, and in the course of that 2 years, their career aspirations might shift fairly dramatically. And in fact, they expect it. In any given year, 80 to 85% of the class could be career changers. So with that sort of, with those numbers and with that expectation, it's not necessarily the best way for them to spend time or have you write about yourself in that way. So instead of that, what are they looking for? So this is where highlighting your personal and professional achievements, like that highlight reel, become a very important thing. So another really, really key part of the MIT Sloan admissions philosophy that's important to know is that they believe very, very firmly that the best predictor of your future success and performance is your past success and performance. And as such, spending a lot of time or a lot of words in your cover letter focusing on your goals and aspirations are not going to be weighed nearly as much as what you've been able to accomplish in the past. In fact, in terms of how they score and rate you, you actually don't get credit for anything that you haven't done yet. So because of that, aspirations and future goals are significantly less important than demonstrating that you've been able to be successful in the things that you're excited about, that you're passionate about, and that you've chosen to put your time and effort into. So another new feature about the cover letter this year is in the prompt they ask you to address extenuating circumstances in the cover letter. So in previous years, the optional essay was where they would direct students. If you had, for example, a subpar GMAT or GPA score, or a gap in your work history, or perhaps if you are not going to get a letter of recommendation from your direct supervisor, in the past they would direct you to the third optional essay or the last optional essay. But this year they're asking the applicants to cover this in the cover letter. And this is challenging for a couple of reasons, because as you'll find, 500 words is really not a lot of space to be able to express the amount of things that most people want to express in the cover letter. So my advice around this is to just be very concise about it and to not dwell. They're not looking so much for excuses about why things were X, Y, and Z. They would like to see some awareness and for you to address it, and really just focus on what is it that you want to tell them about that. So perhaps if you have not had very much quant, or if you had a low quant GMAT, perhaps you've already moved into action by signing up for some courses at a local college in statistics or calculus, for instance, and are doing well. That's the sort of thing that would be worth just noting in the cover letter, and not necessarily dwelling on all of the things surrounding the deficiency as you see it, unless you feel like it's really, really what you want them to focus on. So just be mindful of that in your 500-word essay that you are pretty concise about those things, but that you do address it at this place. So in terms of demonstrating fit with Sloan, this is another area where there's not really explicit directions in the instructions that say why Sloan? Why should you address that? You know, that said, it's important throughout your application that you're painting a picture of yourself as someone who fits into this culture, who gets what Sloan is about and is passionate about Sloan, and will bring the energy that is really key to being part of the Sloan community. So I want to mention this here because it's very common for people to get into a trap of trying to do this, and there's ways to do this very effectively, and there's ways to do it less effectively. And I want to point towards the latter because it's one that I actually see quite a bit when working with applicants. So again, thinking of the fact that the past, they see it as the best predictor of the future. When you're thinking about that, and you're also trying to demonstrate a good fit with Sloan, one thing that I commonly see is that people say, well, I want to show that I'm familiar with the programs, so they'll look through the website of the program, and they'll tag or find some offering of the school, a course usually, and talk about how it will help them in the future. Now, for many colleges, that's very much what they want, because it signals a lot about your initiative in looking into the school and your understanding of what the school offers. But again, with Sloan, it's a little bit different, and that doesn't necessarily get you points. So a very common thing I've seen in applications is where someone says something along the lines of, the course Communication for Managers will help me become a more effective manager when I work with my teams in X industry. So I really get that in the moment when you're writing that, the intention is to signal to the admissions committee that you are excited about moving forward and that you have an understanding of what they're offering and how it fits in. But again, for this particular school and this program and this cover letter, that's not really the most appropriate use of space, and it probably won't benefit you too much to focus your efforts on statements such as that. Also, when you take a big step back, the school is really aware that that's what the class will teach you in a way. Also, sometimes people say things like, MIT Sloan is a great school for entrepreneurship. This is something that the school works very hard on maintaining and establishing. So noting it just very broadly and generically like that, again, doesn't necessarily benefit you or really underscore anything about your candidacy. So if you are feeling like there is a really deep connection with you in the program and you want to demonstrate you have fit, you have to focus a little bit more on showing that you know that that's part of the culture, but instead of talking about how you'll use it in the future, you want to tie it and link it directly to something you've done successfully in the past. So just something to note, the motto of Sloan, or of MIT as a whole, is mens et manus, which is Latin for mind and hand. And it might sound a little cheesy, but really that motto is really core across MIT and certainly to Sloan as well. So with that in mind, if you look at past events and if you want to show fit in the cover letter with Sloan, instead of pointing to things you want to do at Sloan that you think are interesting to you, instead root it in something that you've been successful in the past. For example, there's several action learning labs at Sloan, Sustainability Lab, Global Entrepreneurship Lab, several labs like that. And instead of saying that you're excited about that because it's going to give you really great opportunities to travel around the world and help entrepreneurial organizations, instead of that, I would encourage you to look in the past and show ways that you can connect what you've been able to do in the past to what you want to show. So as an example, you could say something along the lines of talking about when you learned how to build your own computer, and it was through learning that you were able to really understand it and get really excited about technology. And because of that, you're looking forward to the action learning labs because you know from experience that you learn best by doing. Hopefully you're able to see a distinction between those two types, those two approaches, and of course, there's no one right way, but I certainly know from reading a lot of these and knowing from what the admissions committee talks about that really staying anchored in what you've been successful in the past is really the most beneficial thing for you to do and the best way for them to really understand who you are and what you can bring to this community. Okay, and lastly, this one is pretty straightforward, but use standard business correspondent. So as I mentioned earlier, it's a professional document for a professional program. And you really always want to let your personal voice come through, but keep in mind that there's, in this new application this year, there's some really great opportunities later on in the application to really show your creativity. So just remember that in this document you want to use standard business correspondence when you're addressing the admissions committee. So moving on to the essays. Before we actually look at each individual question, let's do a brief overview of the essay instructions. So here in front of you on the slide are the instructions that are taken directly from the admissions site. So again, you have two 500-word essays, which goes very quickly, and you have one supplemental essay. So one of the things that they're really highlighting here is they're interested in learning about you, about how you work and you think and how you act. So more than some schools and some top programs, and very much like the MIT Sloan interviews, they really go for a behavioral approach and really trying to understand how you operate in the world. And how you do this is you provide a brief overview of the situation, as you can see, along with a detailed description of your response. And here is where they ask you to keep it within the past 3 years. So in terms of the brief overview and the detailed description, one thing that's worth noting, and we'll go into this a little bit more in a minute, is they're looking for a clear event, not a long period of time where you were able to implement an idea over several years. They're looking for a snapshot of a moment, and they really want to understand what happened in that moment. What did people say? What did you think? What inspired you or push you to act and behave in a certain way? And when they talk about wanting to be in the past few years, one of the reasons for that is they're really looking for to understand who you are right now. Because people go through a lot of changes and they really are aware of this. So the more recent example you can give, the better they have a sense of who you are right now. If you were to start the program right now, what can they know and understand about how you would operate with your peers and in the program? So in order to do this effectively, they ask you to describe in great detail what you thought, felt, said, and did. And this is where you get a little bit more dimension in your essays. So it can be very, very easy for people to write their essays and have it really just be a list of chronological events or a description of events happening in a certain sequence. What they're looking for is a deeper layer. They really want to know, again, what was going on for you in that moment. What were you thinking, feeling, saying, and doing? So when you're talking about details, you really want to get to a pretty granular level, a snapshot moment of what was going on for you, what you did, and why. So again, these are general strategies, and we'll talk about the individual questions next. But here's some things that I think can be really helpful before you actually dive into writing anything, before you put the pen to paper, and before you really dig into writing these applications. I think it is very helpful to take a step back and really first think of the themes. Really understand what key themes are you trying to communicate with the admissions committee. So one great place to start with this is just on the website. And there's a lot of resources on the MIT Sloan website and links to them about chat transcripts with admissions directors. There's things that they say that they are looking for in candidates on the website. There's some great student blogs. And then both Veritas, Beat the GMAT, and obviously there's several other forums out there or resources where you're able to go out and hear from other students a little bit more about what they're looking for, or what they experienced. And another really great way is actually visiting the campuses of various schools and talking to students themselves. So if you start with the key themes, and then in those key themes that you know are really key, that you want to communicate to the admissions committee, then move on to the stories. It's really helpful to get introspective and have a deep brainstorming session about what stories fit with these themes. Now, they don't necessarily all have to be completely slam dunk, over the top, amazing, crazy essays. They really want to know what has impacted you, and sometimes that's big and sometimes it's small. But the way to write an effective essay, though, is to be really introspective about it. And I would say this is where most people underestimate how much time and effort they have to dedicate to a part of the application process. Because writing, usually once you get started writing, you can start cranking out content. But for it to be really quality content, it's really important to start with some planning ahead and to really starting to understand what you're trying to say and what's available for you to say it in each application. So for instance, you can communicate some of your key themes through your GMAT score, your GPA, or through your letters of recommendations, of course your essays. So doing a little planning up ahead will save you a lot of time in the end when you're struggling to get everything to come together, and also will give you a much stronger application. Because remember, the most effective applications are typically the ones where all the elements work together. Not necessarily where each individual essay standalone is phenomenal, but where everything supports itself. Everything supports one another in terms of describing you as a really strong candidate. And the MIT Sloan Admissions Committee, as well as others, really look at applicants on a holistic level. It's not that one data point is going to make or break you. So really keep in mind and plan ahead about how you're going to have all these things come together in your application. Lastly, answer the questions. Even though I just said you really want to, know what you want to say first, that absolutely holds true. But it's a little bit of a balancing act because you also have to keep yourself within the bounds of the questions that they've asked. So they ask these questions very specifically for certain reasons, and you have to respect that and respond accordingly. And I think the key thing to remember about this is that as you're writing, you really want to drive the essays. You don't want the essays to drive you. And just going back to those first 2 points I talked about on this slide, doing the previous planning and the deep work around brainstorming and knowing what you want to communicate, doing that up front tends to save a lot of time. and helps you craft really solid essays for each of these individual answers. So let's launch into the essays, the individual essays. Essay 1, describing a time when you had to convince a person or a group of your idea. This question is a carryover from previous years. It's been in rotation for a little while, which suggests that it's a really effective tool, like the cover letter, for the admissions committee to learn about candidates. It also signals that even though they've tweaked the wording of the question a little bit from year to year, but having a question about influence and trying to understand the ability and style of how each candidate influences groups and people is a really fundamental part of what they're looking for. It signals that they believe that this is a key component, a key element that will make a student successful both at Sloan and beyond. So in terms of some strategies for Essay 1, they're really looking for what impact you have on people around you. So really think for examples in your work or in your personal experiences or your extracurricular activities. What impact do you have on people? They're trying to understand, are you someone who can motivate people to come into action? Are you someone who can influence people to shift their behaviors? Can you get people on board with an idea? These are some of the things they're looking to understand through this question. And then building on that, or really going a layer deeper, they also need you to clarify how you influence others and what is your leadership style. So for some applicants out there who haven't had the opportunity to have a ton of management experience, for instance, don't worry, because influence and leadership doesn't have to be necessarily in a management framework. There's a lot of ways that you can demonstrate that you are able to influence people. Sometimes that might be managing up. It could mean working with the board of directors or working with your supervisors or upper management to take a different approach, or it can be influencing your peers. So perhaps you're an engineer and you've been able to convince your teammates to take a different technical approach based on your thinking or an idea you had. Those are also fair game. So there's really no one thing that they want to hear being a top school. They really want to hear what you've been able to do and why it was meaningful. So moving on from that idea, and going back to one of the things I mentioned in the broad strategies, is you want to get to a deep level of detail where you're going beyond just saying, this is what I did. I did this, then this, and then this, and then this. You also want to let them know why you did those things. When you made that certain decision, or when you said something to someone, what was it in terms of your values, your core beliefs, or your determination? What was it that had you frame it in that way? And that's a really valuable thing for them to understand, and really at the core of what they're trying to know with this question. And everything I've just said is quite a bit, again, to fit into 500 words. And so you want it to be concise. So just a reminder here, the STAR format, which stands for situation, task, action, and result, is a really good, tried and true way to structure your essays in a way that they flow smoothly and clearly, and that you're capturing all the key elements. One more thing to mention, in this 500 words, it's so tight. Don't forget also that they're not looking for future aspirations. So it's also really tempting for people when they're writing these essays to have a tagline at the end or a last paragraph that says, because of this, because of what I learned in this experience, I'm going to bring it to Sloan to do X, Y, and Z. Or I know now, never, in the future when I lead a company, it's not going to involve X, Y, and Z. They're not so concerned about your future plans. Again, it makes sense with a situation, action, task, result. It's really great to just end with a really solid result and show how you were able to make an impact in the situation, and you can end right there. So knowing that might save you some editing and save you a couple words that you will be able to put to better use in this essay. So essay 2, describe a time when you overcame a personal setback. So this is a new question this year, which is interesting, and it's about understanding how you move through challenges. So this is an interesting question too, because in a way it's quite different from the cover letter in that it really gives you a really great opportunity to show a little bit more of your human side. So some things to keep in mind when you're writing this essay. This is not necessarily a failure essay, and I mention that because it could be tempting to bring in or retool a failure essay from a different school and rework it to fit this essay. Now you might want to, you might have an example from a different school, which is really great and really fits this question. But just as a reminder, for people who read a lot of these, you can really tell when things are cut and paste from one application to another. It really sticks out. So that's just something to note, that that's not the ideal strategy, but also that they're not necessarily asking for a failure essay. In fact, it can also come from a personal experience. So I was talking to an admissions director at Sloan who noted, some people are getting a little alarmed at this question because they feel like they didn't have some really deep, really deep experience that they had to overcome that was really, really difficult. It can be something from work. It can be something just that you define as a setback. So don't get worried if you don't feel like you have a really dramatic, blockbuster story to use for this essay. That's absolutely fine. Again, they're really just looking to understand you. So this is where you want to let your unique voice come through. You want to talk about what it meant for you. And when you think about it in those terms, a person can really learn a lot about you from how you frame up this question. How do you define a setback? How do you move through it? And this is interesting in the business school context too, because for all of the really great opportunities and amazing experiences that you will inevitably have in any business school setting, there are also a lot of challenges. So you're going to be moving into a group of people who are really aiming to up their game professionally and personally. And as part of that, you're going to be faced with more setbacks, inevitably, because you're playing a bigger game. So for example, coming out of any one of these programs, you're going to be competing with really smart people for some of the top roles at very big companies. Or you're going to be working on creating the very best product that you can out there and selling it. Or maybe you're going to be looking for investment money and going down the hard road of raising money. And a lot of times also you're going to be doing this in a team, both in school and out. So they can learn a lot about you in terms of how you've done this in the past. What are your strategies for moving through challenges, and how are you in a team and in a group to keep moving forward? This is going to be different for everyone, but I think this can be a really great thing, a really great opportunity to share with the admissions committee who you're going to be in the program and in that team through telling about how you've done it in the past. So lastly, we have the supplemental essay overview. So this is a brand new question. It's very interesting. The admissions committee is inviting applicants to share anything else they'd like the admissions committee or future classmates to know. And in addition, they're opening it up to different formats. It can be multimedia. So this is an interesting new question that came out of the fact that when they would ask people in the interview environment, a lot of times as they were wrapping up an interview, they would ask applicants, is there anything else you want us to know, anything else you'd like to share or wish we'd asked? And they realized that more often than not, applicants or candidates were coming up with these great things that actually ended up influencing their decision about that person's candidacy. So this is an experiment really for them to open it up. So this is another great thing about Sloan is that the innovative and entrepreneurial spirit certainly doesn't stop at the students. It extends to the faculty, to the administration, and as you can see, the admissions committee as well. So they're excited to throw this out there and see what they get back. And they're open, very open to what this could be. They've mentioned that it could be a Pinterest page, it could be a PowerPoint presentation, it could be something you've prepared or something else, it could be a link to your personal photo album. And they haven't been very strict about the parameters here, but a few guidelines that they have thrown out. If it's a presentation, probably 10 slides would be a good max. If it's a multimedia presentation, you probably don't want to go too much more than 30 seconds. Because remember, they're probably going to be going through several thousand of these. So be mindful of that and use your best judgment in this. But this is a really exciting new format that they're bringing on this year. Before I move on, another thing worth noting is they've recently adopted a new way of looking and processing their applications, which is on the iPad. And it's actually a software that came out of MIT Sloan, Sloanies from the class of 2008, which developed a software. So it's really interesting. You'll see them doing all their scoring in the interview and on an iPad and also viewing it here. So that's just something that's worth noting, so you know, so you have an understanding of how they're evaluating you and in what way. So a few more quick points about the supplemental essay is this is an optional essay. Because it's there does not mean you should feel obligated to use it. In fact, if you feel like you're forcing yourself to take advantage of it, I might encourage you to back off or to really think about whether or not that's the best decision. And I say that because sometimes when people really force themselves to push one more thing into their application through an optional essay, sometimes it dilutes their themes or dilutes their overall application or profile, and sometimes it also becomes a little bit of distraction. So I would say really focused on the required questions. If it moves you, if you have something you really want to share, go for it, but don't feel obligated to do so. This is an entirely new question, so you can be bold. There's no parameters here. This is really up to people to be as creative as they want to be and to really try and wow the admissions committee with what you're sharing. And lastly, it's interesting because it references classmates, and you know, since it's a new question, they haven't done this before. And this is interesting too because I think, you know, it definitely highlights the community element of MIT Sloan culture, which is very, a very core part of the MIT community. And I can see this again in an innovative and entrepreneurial way evolve into potentially something interactive, something that maybe starts to connect admitted students before the school begins. I'm not really sure about that, but I think it's an interesting thing to consider and to keep in mind as a possibility as you're presenting to really start to engage what would I want to share with my classmates. And that kind of leads into some of the strategies that I would recommend. If you feel moved to use this essay, I think a really great place to start is to really envision yourself in the Sloan community first. Because again, going back to that idea that I talked about in the cover letter, it's a really good idea throughout your application. You want to show that you have the elements and you have the characteristics that are a really great fit with Sloan. So when you envision yourself in the Sloan community, you can start to probably connect a little bit better what it is that would be really appropriate and really, really great for you to share with your classmates. I apologize for that. So you also want to share yourself. So going on with that idea of community at MIT, I'll wait for just a minute. I'll just keep going then. Great. Excellent. So sharing yourself, going on with that idea of the MIT Sloan community, probably more than a lot of schools out there, students are really the driving factor for pretty much everything on campus. So everything from clubs to events, even internationally attended conferences, really are driven by student involvement and student activity. So when I talk about sharing yourself, I mean really think about what is it that you want the community to know about you. And if you think about it creatively, you know, it doesn't have to be all business. And in fact, some of the really most dynamic and enriching things that people can bring to the table have nothing to do with business. For instance, for several years, there's been a band called the Rolling Sloans, and it's just new incarnations happen every year, depending on, it's a rock band, depending on the students who show up and want to be a part of that and play that. And that group plays at functions, they're a part of a lot of things, and it's a really fun part of the Sloan experience and really is core to the school spirit that we talk about. So really share yourself. What do you want? What do you want them to know that you're going to bring to the table as not just a classmate in the classroom, but also as someone who's part of a really fun, dynamic, excited and engaged community. And lastly, again, this is an optional essay, so I would discourage you from using this extra space because you feel like you have some killer material from another essay from another school. So it's a really tempting thing to do, and I've seen people do it. But again, from a judgment perspective, if you feel like that's something you want to do, I would challenge you to take a step back and see if it really fits with the rest of your profile, if it repeats any information. And if it does either of those things, I would say that it's probably not the best use of that time or really showing the best judgment on your part. So just keep that in mind if you're on the fence about whether or not to use that question. So that's pretty much it. Just to recap, MIT Sloan essays in a nutshell. The essays have been reduced, so now the written portion is a cover letter and 2 essays. There are some new questions and formats that are reaching for a deeper level of information about who candidates are. So really remember that and bring that to the table when you're writing your essays. Some things to remember about the individual elements for the cover letter. Again, think highlight reel. What do you really want to capture in that short space of time that really frames and captures some of the knockout elements of your profile and your candidacy? Essay 1 is how you influenced others and how you worked. Essay 2, which is largely about what has shaped you and who you are and how you move through challenges. And both of these, because past is a great predictor of the future performance from their perspective, both of these are going to tell them a lot about who you are likely to be in the MIT Sloan program and also beyond. So definitely, it looks like with this version of the application, the admissions committee is reaching for a broader and deeper and more creative understanding of applicants. Some things to remember: there are no right answers. The best answers are the ones that are true to you and your situation, your values, and your passions. These are things that they really genuinely want to understand. So it's a competitive school, but don't worry and don't get pulled too far into this idea that top schools want to hear X, Y, or Z. They really want to hear about you, and they really want to know and understand who you are. So remember, no right answers. 2, the STAR method. Again, if you feel like you have a better way to do it, by all means, go for it. But we definitely have seen that that can be a very effective way to just be very concise about what you've done and to really end and cap it off at the results. And lastly, be genuine. Like I said, they really want to know who you are. And a really great application, at the end of it, they should be able to, set down the application, and they should be able to imagine you not just in the room, but in the community. So hopefully you'll have given them a really good sense of, who are you going to be, the night before midterms? You're going to be the person who's, cheering the team on? Are you going to be the supportive helper? Are you going to be the person who's a visionary leader? There's a lot of different ways that people are excel and have great leadership. You really just want to bring to the table who you are and what your version of that is. So this slide just talks about some of the packages that are available through Veritas. We have comprehensive school packages where you work with both a head consultant, who is essentially a coach and project manager throughout the experience and throughout the process, and you also work with school specialists who are students, or former students who graduated from these top programs, who can talk to you about your fit with the program and how to better tailor your story or tell your story of who you are to show that you have a really great fit with some of these great programs out there. There's also hourly packages and editing services, and you can go to our website to see more information. And here is the final contact information in case you do have any information. Feel free to reach out to us. I hope that this has been a helpful presentation for you, and I hope that we hear from you and wish you the very best of luck in this process. Thank you very much, and Eric, I will send it back to you.
Sylvia, thank you so much for that great presentation. If you joined us a little bit late, we've been listening to Sylvia Dizan walk through her analysis and breakdown of this year's 2012-2013 MIT Sloan School of Management application essay questions. So at this point, we're ready to take your questions. If you have a question for Sylvia that you would like to get answered live, you can do so by posting your question as a new comment right here on the MIT Sloan MBA Watch comment wall. This is going to be a moderated chat. There won't be any audio or video. It'll be all text chat, and we're going to see your questions coming in and publish them one by one and have Sylvia answer your questions live, as many as we can for the remaining time. So a huge thank you to our good friends at Veritas Prep, as well as Sylvia for co-hosting today's session. It was a really great presentation with a lot of insights on MIT Sloan. And also a very big thank you to our audience members for joining us today. So we're ready to take your questions, so post away.